Hello and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Radcliffe Institute brings together students, scholars and practitioners from across disciplines and professions to create and share transformative ideas. You can participate in this laboratory of ideas by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collection held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more about Radcliffe, please feel free to sign up to receive information on news and events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Tina Tallon. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. Tina Tallon is a composer, a computer musician, vocalist, and scientist. She learned to play the piano and the violin as a child. She went on to study biological engineering at MIT and spent the early years of her career researching the biomolecular basis of pancreatic cancer and endometriosis. In 2010, she received a commission from the League of Imaginary Scientists. She was asked to write the sound for a science and art exhibit relating the surface of bacteria on planet Earth to that and that of a close-up views of planet Mars. The exhibit went on view at Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, Australia, and later at the Museum of Contemporary Arts in Los Angeles. Tallon's music has since been widely performed internationally by many ensembles and musicians. Her first string quartet, Selective Defrosting, won Grand Prize in the Parma Student Composer Competition, and her dissertation, Lucinia, won an ASCAP Morton Gold Young Composer Award. She was also the recipient of a Barlow Endowment General Commission to support the composition of new work for violinist and composer Kurt Rode for viola and live electronics. Tallon is active not only as a composer and passionate advocate for new music, but also as a vocalist, educator, and art documentarian. She frequently performed as a soloist with the MIT Chamber Chorus and Concert Choir and other groups. Additionally, she served as assistant to the artistic director of the Boston Modern Orchestra Project and an assistant producer for the Grammy-winning BMOP Sound label. She also served as general manager of the San Diego's Fresh Sound Music series. Academically, her research interests include technological mediation of the human voice, virtual tactility, the relationship between semi-static and music cognition, computational modeling of energetic relationship between various musical parameters based upon Newtonian mechanics, development of software for spectral analysis and composition, algorithmic composition, and computational approaches to musicological inquiry. Tina holds an SB degree in biomedical engineering and music from MIT and an MFA in composition and music theory from Brandeis University. She is currently completing her PhD in composition at the University of California, San Diego. At Radcliffe, Tina is working on Shrill, an electroacoustic chamber opera that will examine the ways that gender bias in the development and regulation of voice technology has shaped history. Everything from microphones to modes of transmission has been optimized for lower voices, and the gender invective directed at women in the media has changed very little since the dawn of the broadcast era. Told from the perspective of 4 female-identified vocal laborers, a switchboard operator, a radio announcer, a modern presidential candidate, and a virtual digital assistant, it will grapple with questions of embodiment, virtuality, agency, and identity construction. The set will include novel sculptural electronic instruments and interactive elements. Ultimately, Shrill will entreat listeners to examine their own biases and inspire advocacy for voices that are silenced in our society by structural inequality. And with that, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Tina Tallon.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that very warm introduction, and to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study for its support of my research and creative practice. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit of the research that is underpinning what will eventually become the opera that Claudia told you about. And it's also going to be manifesting in a book project. So I want to thank you all for joining me this morning. I'm coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I sit on the native land of the Massachusetts people. So for the past decade, there's been a lot of discourse on technological bias, particularly surrounding algorithmic justice. And of course, these biases aren't new. We've also seen a lot of recent research on racial bias in the technological development of camera sensors, film, and lighting equipment. And I have a number of fantastic colleagues who are engaged in that work. However, while there's been significant attention given to bias in the way that we discuss vocal labor and its relationship to power structures, there's actually been much less discussion and research on the deep-seated technological underpinnings of these biases. First, I'd like to mention that while much of the discourse reinforces a gender binary, this is not just a problem that affects people who identify as female. And of course, our understanding of gender identity and expression has become much more nuanced over the past century. So I desperately hope that we can begin incorporating these more sophisticated understandings of gender in our studies and analyses moving forward. So my interest in the subject began from an early age. I actually grew up in a pretty conservative household in which my father regularly listened to Rush Limbaugh. So for me, hearing the word shrill in reference to female politicians was unfortunately pretty commonplace. By the time I turned 18 in 2008, yes, I'm a 90s kid, and I proudly registered to vote for my first presidential election, I was pretty sick of shrill. But unfortunately, 2008 also coincided with a resurgence in the word shrill with Hillary Clinton's first run for president. An article in the Columbia Journalism Review caught my attention around the same time, entitled Shrillery. And one of the subtitles is Clinton's problem as basic as her voice? And this, of course, led me to wonder, is it as basic as her voice? And how much more is there to this argument? Now, of course, we all know by now that there is, but the focus on shrillness hasn't exactly subsided in the past decade. Here's a clip of Democratic strategist Julie Roginski in an exchange with Tucker Carlson back in 2016 during Clinton's second run.
You have a bunch of men, both running against her and also in the pundit class, who are saying things about her, that she's shrill, that she's shouting.
Maybe she is shrill. Maybe she is shouting. What does that have to do with her gender?
Because when was the last time you had a man be accused of being shrill? That is such a code word.
I don't know. I think a lot of men are shrill.
I don't think I've ever heard a man be called shrill.
First of all,
I called Ted Cruz shrill.
Can I just call BS this?
Yes.
No man on television has called Hillary Clinton shrill.
Oh, please.
Because that is a felony offense and everybody knows it.
I'm sure I can find one or two examples.
No, you're not. Nobody uses the word shrill.
Really? I can find one or two examples.
Nobody uses the word shrill. And I think at this point, all of us can think of at least 1,000 or 2,000 examples. Now, regardless of your politics, that's a much longer conversation that we will surely be grappling with, particularly on the left, over the next 4 years. We can't deny that the voice is the site of so much when it comes to identity construction, both individually and societally. And as we gain a better understanding of the history of words such as shrill, are we simply replacing them with different words, such as likability and electability? So before we dig into this history, I'd first like to begin by asking the question, what is sound? Though we all experience it in different forms on a daily basis, I don't think it's safe to assume that we all share the same understanding of how it works or even what it is. While there's certainly philosophical considerations here at play, hence the tree having fallen in a forest, for the sake of time, I'm going to begin by focusing on just the technical ones that'll be relevant to our discussion later. So sound, in essence, is the vibration of particles in a medium. So here we have a nice little illustration of some of the waves that govern the movement of these particles in various media. And of course, these media can be solid, they can be liquid, and they can be gaseous, such as the air that we breathe every day. Now, there are two words that kind of are relevant in this discussion, one of which is frequency, which is related to how fast these particles move. This is related to what we would perceive as pitch of a sound, and amplitude, which is related to how far the particles move, and that is loosely related to volume. Well, there's an asterisk there, and we'll talk about some of those loose relations in a minute. One of the ways that we represent sound as audio engineers and researchers is through the use of waveforms, and these graph amplitude of the sound over time. And if you zoom in on one of these, I'm sure you've all seen a waveform at some point, you can actually see these tiny vibrations being graphed. And if you imagine one of those little red particles that were in our previous illustration moving back and forth, if we turn that on its side, you now can see these vertical traces of its motion. Now, no talk about the history of voice technology would be complete without listening to one of the first ever recordings of the human voice. So this is what you're about to hear is what's called a phonautograph, or a phonautographic transcription, which came from an inventor named Edward Léon Scott's invention called the phonautograph, which comes from 1857, excuse me. What this was essentially a giant diaphragm, or this thing that looks almost like a balloon, that collected these vibrations in the air, and then via a needle would actually trace them onto a piece of sooted paper. And that's what you see here on the right. And both of these I've gotten from a website that does an amazing job of studying and archiving these early sonic transcription devices called firstsounds.org. So this is a phonautograph of Edward Léon Scott himself singing the French song Au clair de la lune. So this one dates back from April of 1860. And you can hear that while we can't really quite make out any sort of consonants, there are no fricatives or sibilants, we mainly do hear just vowels. You can make out some semblance of the human voice, and you can see on the right that some of these vibrations are actually traced into the soot on the paper. Another way that we look at sound and that we represent it is through the use of what is called a spectrogram. Now, the spectrogram takes into account not only amplitude, but also frequency. So it looks at all of these different speeds of vibration of particles in the air over time. So the spectrogram that you see before you is one of this audio file. A, E, U, which is the unfortunate recording of me singing 3 different vowel sounds. Now, what you'll notice is that if you were to go try to play what I just sang on the piano, you would probably press 1 key for all 3 of them. That would be middle C, or thereabouts. And that key, that appraisal of the quote-unquote pitch of the sound, is what is resultant from the fundamental, what we call the fundamental frequency. And that's, of course, this lowest line on the spectrogram. And this is also the segment of sound that we often associate with vowels in human speech and singing. Now, there's obviously a lot more information in this graph. This is everything above, which is known as the overtones. And if these are in integer multiples of each other, they are known as harmonic. So for instance, if you take your fundamental, if it's 200 hertz and you multiply it by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you end up with these even distributions of horizontal lines above the sound. Now, you can also see that there's significant variation between these 3 sounds, even though they seem to be the same pitch. And that's why the overtones are so important. So it's all of this higher frequency information that allows us to distinguish between different types of vowel sounds in human speech. Or in the case of consonants, it's essentially pretty much conditioned on everything other than the fundamental. So without leaving behind our discussion of the types of technology and representations of sound, we also have to take into account the way in which humans perceive sound. And here I also want to say that this is what I'm about to describe is just one way that humans perceive sound. People perceive sound in a lot of different ways that don't necessarily involve the human hearing apparatus as pictured. So of course, the vibrations in the air travel through your auditory canal. They slam into your tympanic membrane or your eardrum, and then a series of organic transducers then allow those vibrations to be transmitted and transduced into electronic signals that our brain then interprets as sound in this specific paradigm. Of course, there are many other ways that we experience sound, and people who are deaf may not necessarily experience sound in the same way. And I want to make sure we give voice to that. Now, in terms of that specific paradigm that I just mentioned, I also want to be clear that we don't always perceive frequencies the same way. So this is what's known as the Fletcher Monsoon equal loudness contour, or a set of the Fletcher Monsoon equal loudness contours. And these are the result of research that came from two researchers in the 1930s named Harvey Fletcher and Wilden Munson. And basically they wanted to gain a more detailed understanding of how the human hearing apparatus processes different frequencies. I prefer to look at this graph this way, so upside down, because here we can kind of talk about the hearing range in terms of our ear's sensitivity. So above the top on the horizontal axis, we have frequency, and then along the side on the vertical axis, we have sound, pressure level, or intensity in decibels. And so essentially you can see that we have more sensitivity in sounds between 1,000 and approximately 7,000 hertz, and this sensitivity falls off below that and above it. So what does this mean? This means that we're essentially more sensitive to higher frequency sounds. And if you don't believe me, we can do a nice little example. That was 200 hertz, and here is 2,000 hertz. And I can pretty much guarantee you that you found one of those to be a little bit more piercing, and most likely it was the 2,000 hertz tone. Now, here's a spectrogram of both of those sounds. You can see that, first of all, these are sine tones, so there's not a lot of other spectral or frequency information in the sound, and also they're clearly the same volume as shown by the same coloration here. And so, what this means, why is this, why is this relevant? Well, evolutionary biologists have hypothesized that, of course, we're a little bit more sensitive to higher frequency sounds because that's where a lot of warning calls exist in terms of frequency space. There's selective pressure for organisms that can more quickly respond to these types of sounds. Also, acoustically, we're better able to localize higher frequencies because the wavelength of those waves, of those sound waves, are shorter. So again, more accurate appraisal of these sounds more quickly allows for better snap decisions when survival's on the line. So now that we've got a little bit of a basis in sound here, I'd like to discuss some of the history of the technology that's involved. Many people peg the beginning of voice technology, or at least electrically mediated voice technology, in 1876 with the invention, or rather the patenting of the telephone. That's a much longer story for another time. But I think it's actually really important to begin this story about 2 decades earlier in 1853. And the reason for this has to do with the intersection of voice technology infrastructure, surveillance capitalism, and policing. Some of you may have recently seen Sarah Cooper's Netflix special, Everything's Fine, which if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it. It captures the current time that we're living in like nothing else that I've seen before. And one of the sketches that it begins with is a faux Ken Burns style documentary about the history of voice technology and policing called Karens, narrated by Whoopi Goldberg. And of course, it talks about the invention of the telephone as a way for white women to more efficiently report the presence of African Americans in their community in Boston. And while it may seem like sarcasm and a nice little bit of comedy, it's actually not too far from the truth. So in 1853, Reverend Augustus R. Pope, just up the road from me in Somerville, Massachusetts, patented the electric burglar alarm. Unfortunately, he was a reverend and not a businessman, so he didn't exactly make bank with it. However, Edwin Holmes came along and bought the patent off of him in 1857. So Augustus R. Pope unfortunately passed away from typhoid that year. And Edwin Holmes went and launched on a career of trying to sell burglar alarms. Now, there wasn't a huge market for them in Boston because unfortunately there wasn't a lot of crime. And so no one really wanted to go through and invest in this infrastructure. Also, people didn't really trust electricity yet. Electric light bulbs didn't really come into prominence until the early 20th century. So people were really hesitant to kind of electrify their window sashes and door frames. So in 1859, Holmes moved his operation to New York City. And he called New York City, in his writings where he talks about this move, he said, it is the city where every thief in the nation made his home, which unfortunately has some white nationalist and anti-immigrant undertones, actually. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Leslie Harris, has a fantastic book entitled In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City between 1626 and 1863. And I'd actually really encourage you to read some of her research on what life was like during that era. So throughout the 1860s, the popularity of the electric burglar alarm spread, and soon Holmes began setting up central monitoring stations in order to ensure prompt service. And he even actually set up his own private security force. And of course, when we look at the Reconstruction era, there are absolutely racial undertones to this as well. So in 1877, he said, hey, things are going great in New York City. How about I send my son, Edwin T. Holmes, back to Boston to copy the system there? Now, in 1876, we of course had the invention of the telephone, or the patenting of the telephone, and the establishment of the American Bell Telephone Company in Boston. And so when Edwin T. arrived in Boston, there was already infrastructure starting to be laid for a telephone service throughout the Boston metropolitan area. And so what Edwin T.'s innovation is that he said, hey, people aren't using telephone lines at night. So how about we kind of do a little bit of a service share on the telephone lines at night to monitor our burglar alarms? And so we kind of have this this weaving together of the infrastructure of surveillance capitalism and telephony. So, unfortunately, the infrastructure was not great in 1877 and 1878. And so there were a lot of switchboard operators that were needed to be able to monitor all of these different exchanges. In 1877, we see here a picture on the left of what a switchboard operation room may have looked like, and it was staffed by primarily young white boys. This led to a lot of issues, particularly given some of the bugs in the system. Apparently, young boys would frequently swear at the customers, who were often irate because of delays or denials of service. Apparently, this even led to some physical altercations, and this was really bad for business. And so in 1877, Edwin T. said, you know what, I think I'm just going to start hiring young women because, of course, they're much more docile and their customers are going to be less likely to swear at them. Of course, he only hired primarily US-born upper to middle class white women for this work. And so white women became a critical human component of the Bell System's infrastructure in terms of ensuring both customer satisfaction and profitability. So scholar Venus Green, who in her book Race on the Line, details an enormous amount of extremely detailed research on the Bell System. And she actually used to work for the Bell System before becoming a professor. I highly recommend reading that book if you're interested. She outlines a lot of the parameters involved in the Bell System's hiring practices for operators. So in 1910, 93.7% of the Bell System operators were US-born white women, and they were mostly young women. Some reasons for exclusion from hiring included race, a refusal or inability to work weekends and holidays, which was often tied to religion. Jews were excluded. And then apparently the most common reason was quote-unquote unacceptable accents. And here we get into the policing of female voices. So this is from a switchboard operation conference in 1906, in which one of the trainers notes that the training of the voice to become soft, low, melodious, and to carry well is the most difficult lesson an operator has to learn. Now, something else very interesting happened in 1906 as well, and this is where we get kind of the dawn of broadcast radio in the United States. So this is in December 21st, I believe, is when one of the first radio broadcasts was actually transmitted from Brant Rock in Massachusetts. And by the time that we start getting popular adoption of broadcast radio as one of the primary means of information dissemination, we also start getting a lot of criticism of female voices on air. So some of the criticisms include their voices are flat or they are shrill, and they're usually pitched far too high to be modulated correctly. And these types of criticism go on and on and on and on and on and on. And I don't have time to get into all of them, but you can absolutely see the tenor of a lot of these. What's interesting is that, of course, people would have been used to female voices coming through various types of speakers for almost 50 years now, and suddenly this has become problematic. So why is that? This article published in 1928 in Scientific American sheds a little bit more light on the issue. So the particularly relevant thing here comes from Dr. J.C. Steinberg of Bell Labs, which is one of the preeminent, actually one of the only audio technology research institutions in the United States. We don't have time to talk about monopolization at AT&T and trust busting, but that also plays an enormous part in the story. So one of the things that was published here is that, secondly, the speech characteristics of woman, when changed to electrical impulses, do not blend with the electrical characteristics of our present-day radio equipment. So that's quite curious. So I decided to start digging into this. So what specifically were the electrical characteristics that didn't blend, and how did they have such far-reaching implications? So here's a brief from the Bell Laboratory record in 1927 by the aforementioned Dr. J.C. Steinberg. And here's one of the bits of information that's particularly salient. So he notes that the elimination of all frequencies above 5,000 cycles affects only slightly the interpretation of masculine speech. For women's voices, such elimination would produce considerable degradation in interpretation, and it is estimated that frequencies as high as 7,000 must be transmitted to give possibilities of interpretation corresponding to a man's voice. Okay, that's a great statement to be able to keep tabs on, but he takes it a step further, and he thus asserts that it appears that nature has so designed woman's speech that it is always most effective when it is of soft and well-modulated tone. So unfortunately, regardless of the fact that there was a clearly articulated technical problem that they knew about, rather than fixing it, they just blame female voices for causing the problems as opposed to the technology for the types of limitations that it imposed. So why 5,000 hertz? Why couldn't they just fix it? You know, if they knew that it wasn't working, why didn't they do anything to counteract that? Well, the Radioactive 1927 played a big role in this. So as radio stations popped up all across the United States during the 1920s, unfortunately, we ended up with a lot of signal interference, particularly in urban areas. It was the wild, wild west. There was kind of no regulation in terms of who could start broadcasting on what frequencies. So the Radio Act allotted 10,000 hertz of bandwidth to each station. Keep that in mind, because amplitude modulation radio, or AM radio, as many of you are most familiar with, actually ends up doubling the bandwidth of the signal. So we have our baseband signal, which is situated here at the microphone. It goes through a bunch of equipment that modulates it and then sends it out of the radio tower. So if we have a 10,000 hertz limit on the bandwidth of our modulated signal, it means that we need to have a 5,000 hertz limit on the baseband signal. So here's where some of these limitations have been applied to the equipment. And of course, once you have a limitation like that, people start designing all of their equipment to cater to it, and it becomes set in stone. Now, there's another issue at play here that involves measurement in terms of what may have informed the decision to go with 10,000 hertz. There are a lot of different types of factors that were involved in that decision, but one of them has to deal with faulty research. And I'd like to invoke something that you might be familiar with if you've seen the HBO docuseries Chernobyl or have ever read any of the books. And that is the concept of 3.6 Röntgen, which one of the supervisors said, oh, that's not great, but that's not terrible. As you see in the picture on the left, it turns out that 3.6 Röntgen was actually the limit of detection for the equipment that they were using. And when they brought in a more industrial strength dosimeter, they found out that the levels were actually greater than 15,000 Röntgen, which is actually really, really terrible. And this, of course, was an enormous tragedy that led to thousands of deaths and decades of health problems for people in the area. And it's one of probably the largest environmental disasters in human history. So the importance of good measurement devices and clear communication is extremely important. So let's talk about some of the measurement devices being used in the early history of voice technology. So this is a picture of one of the early condenser microphones that may have been used for auditory research. And unfortunately, we find out that this couldn't accurately measure anything above 5,000 hertz. So here's a paper from the Physical Review in which they actually outline calibration procedures and take early data with this. And we find out that beyond 5,000 cycles per second, the energy is so low as to be impossible of measurement with the apparatus used. So here's some of the data that they got from this microphone, which is graphed over here on the right side of the slide. Also, one thing that's funny about this is they only used 6 different subjects to test their voices and take data from, 4 of which were male, 2 of which were female, and then they later averaged these results together. This is something that frequently happens where they just test significantly fewer women in these studies. And so unfortunately, we're not represented well in the data either. And of course, you can see that these graphs, they stop at 5,000 hertz. So there's just simply no measurement being taken of all of the frequency information above that. So essentially, they knew that they couldn't detect it. They didn't care. They may have known that, you know, as equipment got better, it was important, but unfortunately things had kind of become what we call path dependent, or, you know, a standard gets set and unfortunately that sticks around. The QWERTY keyboard is actually another great example of path dependency, especially when it shows up on your phone, because of course thumbs are very different from typing with 10 fingers. So in response to this, early consumer radio in 1920, of course, couldn't accurately really receive anything above 5,000 hertz, and this led to a lot of issues. So what does this actually sound like? I have a number of examples prepared for you. On the left, we have the high voice, and on the right, we have the low voice, both saying the same sentence, which I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to prime you for identification. So here is our first sound sample. These are band limited to represent what these voices may have sounded like on radios in the 1920s.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
And what you'll notice is that you can most likely pick out significantly more consonants in the lower voiced example here. And if we zoom in on these spectrograms, by the way, I have been focusing on 5,000 hertz. We're not going to have time to get into it, but spoiler alert, voice band frequencies actually became limited between 300 and 3,400 hertz. So it actually was even more reduced from 5,000 hertz. So that's what I've exemplified here. And here we see that there's just simply less information now because of the way that things have been limited. If you look at the spacing of those bands in the high voice vertically, you can see that there's much more space in between them, which means that we're just getting less information for our brain to be able to go through all of these pattern matching algorithms that it does to identify different vowels and consonants, whereas there's much more information in the lower voice. Here's what those files sounded like before I processed them with kind of the full fidelity recording.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
And presumably it's much easier to understand what's being said. You know, it's hypothesized that as long as we have up to about, by the way, the human hearing range extends from about 20 hertz at the bottom to 20,000 hertz at the top. That's why this scale is so much more expanded. And with that extra information, you know, at that point, we're doing pretty good in terms of intelligibility and articulation. So we would think, okay, we're probably fine now, right? Unfortunately, we're not, because we still have to contend with a lot of things, including compression algorithms, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with after having spent the last year on Zoom. So here's a pictorial representation of compression. Basically, we're trying to reduce the amount of data that's being transmitted because, of course, we need to be judicious with our use of bandwidth. And so this results in all kinds of artifacts. And the same thing happens with audio. So I'm going to play you just the artifacts from a type of compression known as MP3 compression, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. What I've done is I've subtracted out the original signal, so you just hear the things that result from compression.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
13 thick thistles start 5 fires.
So it might sound like a very garbled, ghastly rendition on those sound files that I just played you. We started with the lower voice and then ended with the higher voice. And what you may notice is that it's actually easier to make out what the sentence was in the second example. And you might think, oh, that's great. You know, that's not so bad, right? That's actually really, really bad, because that means that the compression artifacts are situated in a frequency range that interferes with speech cognition. The more that we can hear the original signal, that means it's more in the space where it's actually interfering. And I'm sure all of you now at this point are very familiar with those types of artifacts. And of course, as we take into account the types of microphones, the types of earbuds, the types of Bluetooth compression that are further applied to the signal, we end up with worse and worse results. A great example of this was the great Yanni Laurel debate of 2018, if any of you remember that, in which compression on the internet was on full display in its effect on speech cognition. And of course, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of other types of biases that are technological in nature that influence how people are seen and heard. This is what's called a Shrill card from Kodak in the 1970s that, of course, showed how their processing and production methodologies were biased towards white skin. And of course, other researchers have been looking into algorithmic bias. Joy Buolamwini is an amazing researcher at MIT who focuses a lot of her work on computer vision and biases in computer vision, although her work is actually extended beyond that, and she's formed something called the Algorithmic Justice League, which now tries to hold different types of corporations and institutions to account in terms of the way that they are using algorithms. So what are some of the systemic outcomes of this? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we did not have the first African-American owned and operated radio station until 1949. African Americans were predominantly only allowed on the radio, not as announcers, but as performers. And so it took a very, very long time for not only markets, but for people to allow African Americans to occupy positions where they could control the narratives that were being presented on air. Some of this also has to do with education and access, in that many white schools were investing in radio equipment, and unfortunately those same investments were not made in segregated schools. Also, this contributed to something that a scholar named Cien Ngai has termed animatedness, particularly when we look at racial exploitation in performance. And she notes in her book, Ugly Feelings, that to be animated in American culture is to be racialized in some way. And so there's inherent exploitation of African Americans and people of color in particular in the media. And this has stuck around since the dawn of the broadcast era. A few last points here. This was from the Democratic debate in 2019. CNN interviewed a Democratic debate coach on how the many women candidates that we had this year could not be perceived as shrill. And she, of course, says to very purposely slow your pace and lower the tone a bit, because that will add meaning or gravitas to whatever it is you're talking about. So we're getting the same advice that we have had since 1906, right? Nothing has really changed. There are many studies that have cited the systemic effects on female voices that have occurred throughout history. This one notes that there was an average drop of about 23 hertz in the fundamental of speech in young Australian women over about 50 years. There are perceptions of trustworthiness that are influenced by voice pitch and gendered context. And of course, we all are familiar with vocal fry, right? And the study in 2014 examined how vocal fry may undermine the success of young women in the labor market. Now, in 2019, the Women's Media Center did a report on racial and gender biases in the media, and we see that these are still persisting, right? There's still vast disparities between women and men in the media landscape. And then, of course, even greater disparities in terms of the incorporation of people of color in newsrooms. And so we have a lot of work to do. So what do we do at this point, right? Where do we go from here? If it seems like we haven't been able to overcome a lot of these technological problems, and it seems like maybe technology is not catching up, what do we do? One important thing that we can do is support women and people with minoritized gender identities, particularly of women of color in audio production roles. This begins by hiring more women, and particularly women of color in audio engineering. A report from the Audio Engineering Society in 2008 found that women make up only about 5 to 7% of professional audio engineers. And then a report in 2019 from USC Annenberg found that women make up 21.7% of artists, 12.3% of songwriters, and only 2.1% of producers. And then within that, the 871 producers that they included in the study, only 4 of them were women of color. That's 0.46%. So we have a lot of work to do. One thing that we can also do if we're working in the music or entertainment industries is insist on inclusion riders. Some of you may have remembered Frances McDormand's speech from the Oscars in 2018, in which she ended with the 2 words inclusion riders. And so you can make demands that your production team represents an equitable society, right? Even if you're not in charge of casting, you can absolutely make sure that people incorporated in that process. You can also get involved with education and training organizations such as Sound Girls, EQL, Techni, Women's Audio Mission, and Audio Girl Africa. These all do amazing work in providing opportunities for women and people with minoritized gendered identities in terms of, placing them with mentors and providing funding and access to equipment. And of course, if you're a politician, you can have an audio advocate or an audio savvy staffer. This is someone who might know how to communicate with audio engineers and ask for specific modifications in clear, concise terms. Of course, oftentimes things are very cramped in terms of time. And so you want to be able to quickly and effectively make the modifications that you need. And of course, in general, if you lead a research or a design team, think about the demographic makeup of your team. Does it reflect what you're trying to study or what you're trying to create? If not, maybe you need to go back and consider who you're actually involving in your research. Think about where you're getting your data and how it's collected. What are the types of biases that are incorporated at those stages? And then lastly, what types of tools are you using for measurement? And what are the social histories of those tools? Ultimately, we all need to be engaged in critically analyzing all of the things that contribute to the systemic disparities and inequities that we see, not only in the media, but in society in general. So I'd entreat everyone to question your biases and never stop questioning the histories of the tools that you're using so that we can all work towards trying to correct some of the things that have been in place for a very long time. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn it back over to Claudia for some Q&A.
Thank you, Tina. This was fantastic. Really, really
thank you.
Engaging. We do have questions, not surprisingly. And the first one is, what are your thoughts on Elizabeth Holmes' artificial voice lowering and how it shaped her public image?
Yeah, I imagined that was probably going to come up. I had actually been asked about that in some interviews before. So the first thing that I would like to say is that when it came to the lawsuits, a lot of people actually cited this voice that many people claim is performative as evidence of her untrustworthiness. And I would like to say that I resist that somewhat because I think that, again, that's engaging in this privileging of the voice as a portion of someone's identity that can be criticized in these inequitable ways. And so I do hesitate to kind of grab onto those things. However, I will say that I've done some analyses. I have some raw data and actually raw audio from interviews that she did with NPR, I believe back in 2005, in which the theory is that she had let her guard down and had kind of adopted a more natural tone. And there was a disparity of, I think, almost 100 hertz. I'd have to go back and look at my data. I'm happy to pass that along. If whoever asked that question, if you want to send me an email, I can show you my analysis. And so, kind of if you take averages over the course of someone speaking, you can look at where the kind of confidence intervals are between what a seemingly normative mode of speech is and what a potentially performative mode of speech is. So, yeah, there are definitely some disparities between what people say is likely her natural voice and what is likely a performative one. But I do hesitate to enter into that mode of criticism, just because it is highly gendered, and there's a very problematic history of it.
That's great. Now I must read this. It says, "What a fantastic capital letters talk. Thanks!" Exclamation mark.
Thank you. Capital letters talk.
Yeah. And the question is, can digital processing of female higher frequency voices modulate them into a more high fidelity transmission frequency distribution? Assuming yes, is this a good path forward?
I wish I could ask the questioner a few questions about their question. I realize that's not necessarily something that we have the ability to do right now. So in terms of being able to secure higher fidelity representations of a voice, in terms of having a greater amount of frequency components involved, right? We're dealing with a lot of different layers of mediation here. First of all, we're dealing with a microphone. We're dealing with the sampling technology that we're using, which is in digital, digital to analog converters, which is something we didn't even get to talk about. We're dealing with software algorithms. Then we're dealing with kind of going back out over the air. We're dealing with streaming. We're dealing with data compression algorithms, multiple layers of that, right? Because especially if you're listening on a Bluetooth device, Bluetooth adds an additional layer of compression, or it often adds an additional layer of Bluetooth compression on the already compressed signal. So even if you have an extremely high fidelity recording as kind of like your baseband signal, there are still multiple modes of signal loss or signal interference. Those maybe aren't the best terms to use. But there's multiple ways in which we have no control over what actually happens. And this is wherein I think a lot of the problems start. Because again, we talk about path dependency, right? We talk about the QWERTY keyboard. We talk about the ways that all of these things are set in stone in some cases. And it seems as if there's nothing that we can really do. So you can always start with the best quality audio that you can possibly get. But of course, it feels in some ways as if there's not really anything we can do, because we can't control what happens to it after we send it out to whatever transmission modalities it needs to go through. So I'm sorry that that's not a particularly rosy outlook on the situation.
That's what it is. The next question asks, how is your opera Shrill going to engage the issues that you've covered in your talk?
That's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely correct, questioner, in that I did not talk about my own creative practice at all in this discussion. So I'm still in the early stages of kind of working on the libretto for the opera, or the text that I'm going to be setting. And so that's kind of why I'm in this research modality. But my creative practice deals a lot with technical mediation of the voice. And I'm particularly interested in ways that we can manipulate intelligibility using a lot of these same frequency characteristics that we've talked about. I use some algorithms called convolutional synthesis that allows me to look at the spectral profiles of things such as instrument sounds or sounds in nature or whatever else, and look at the similarities between human vocal sounds and figure out ways of interpolating between them. So this idea of kind of looking at the liminal spaces between human speech and identity and other types of sounds that we're familiar with, to try to draw connections and create context that allow us to kind of find new ways of looking at things. So that's one of the ways that I deal with that. Also, the opera is going to include some sculptural electronic instruments. So there's a lot of these, I think, that are pretty obvious, right? Switchboards, modular synthesizers use a lot of things that I think are pretty reminiscent of switchboards in terms of plugging cables in and out of different terminals. And this, I think, is by creating sculptural instruments, we can physicalize a lot of these things, right? We respond as humans to things such as resistance, right? Physical resistance that I think on a conceptual level, we also experience every day, but maybe haven't physicalized. And so I feel like this idea of embodying some of these resistances can be really cathartic for people. A lot of my dissertation actually is focused on electronic music as a mode to depersonalize in response to trauma. And so this idea of taking something that's virtual and turning it into something that's physical can, I think, be really, really instructive and kind of shed new light on some of these things. So I realize that's not entirely specific, but somewhat outlines some of the approaches that I hope to be able to take.
Perfect. The next question. In a New York Times article this past Sunday on CNN reporter Abby Phillips. So the writer praised Abby Phillips' voice and her speaking style, slow, deliberate cadence, distinct from the rat-a-tat verbal spray that has characterized cable news for a decade. Comments on that?
Yeah, so as many of us who watched, I believe Abby Phillips was a contributor on CNN over, 2 weeks ago now. I made the mistake of having cable news on in the background for, 7 days straight. And I also found Abby Phillips to be an amazingly calming presence because of her... her poise and everything about the way that she approached the material. But, I do think that she does have a very calming tone of voice. And it's interesting to note this, right? Particularly when we see a lot of male anchors who often kind of yell. This goes a little bit back to that clip that we looked at from Fox News, where Tucker Carlson is literally yelling. And Julie Roginski is, of course, maintaining a very level tone of voice. I've also seen Kamala Harris be praised for her calm demeanor and tone of voice. And when we look at the way that particularly female vocality and particularly female vocality of African-American women is analyzed in the media, there are definitely gendered and racialized notions of what authority looks like that we have to be very aware of in terms of what the discourse is like. I think this is also similar to times in which people have praised African-American men for being articulate, right? We see this with Barack Obama, and that's actually extremely problematic to praise someone for that, because basically what you're saying is, okay, you've defied this stereotyped notion of how I think you should speak. And so while, yes, I do think that on the surface, right, it's fine to note that, of course, Abby Phillips' demeanor was very calm. I do think we need to be aware of some of the underlying biases that might be conditioning the way that we react to someone's voice.
The next question. Different languages have different voices. In my native Norwegian, my voice has a higher frequency than when I speak English. Can you comment on this?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. There are so many other things that I wanted to cover in this talk that I didn't get to, and language and the role that different languages play in terms of the spectral profiles is absolutely something that I think I definitely need to discuss more in my work and research more in my work. There are some researchers out there who are looking at this and who are definitely taking these more comprehensive approaches to looking at the role of language and the spectral profiles of different languages on different types of equipment. For instance, audio technology didn't just develop in the US, right? Germany had a huge hand. Russia had a huge hand in developing early audio technology that in the United States we didn't get access to until after World War II. And so language, of course, plays very distinct roles on how voices are perceived. And there are also societal notions that might be different in different cultures about how the voice functions in terms of power, authority, identity construction. So I can say I'm obviously not fluent in Norwegian and don't know, I'm not an expert and I'm not a linguist, so I can't necessarily comment in that specific case. But I do think that it's important to realize that different languages just have different spectral profiles and that different technologies will act differently on these different spectral profiles. It's also interesting to note that in tonal languages such as Mandarin, we need to focus on different types of parameters when we're doing this analysis, right? Because the actual gestures, the frequency gestures, influence meaning. So not only are we just looking at kind of a semantic context, but the actual sonic gestures do also impart meaning. And so as something that is meaning bearing, we need to give special attention to that in our analyses. And yeah, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that for sure. So thank you for bringing up that point. That's an excellent question.
Going back to the very last part of your talk, how do we reform and democratize listening and mediation technologies and practices when resources such as high-speed internet connections and pro-quality audio gear are often prohibitively expensive?
Yeah, this is a really fantastic question. And I think especially now in 2020, after we've all gone through almost a year or 9 months now, I guess, of having to deal with an intensely mediated existence, kind of entirely conditioned upon our internet connections, the importance of access, comprehensive, universal access to high-speed internet connections has become more and more important, not only for education, but for healthcare, for information, everything now, right? It's pretty clear that one's internet connection influences not only how they come across to others, but what type of resources they have access to. And so I think that we absolutely need to take care in making sure that this infrastructure is democratized, this infrastructure is regulated. I have hopes that we'll be able to roll back some of the things that happened with net neutrality in the previous administration, although that doesn't solve the problem, right? We still need better access. When it comes to public utilities for high-speed internet connections, there's a lot of research being done there in terms of how we can ensure high-speed connections, especially to rural populations, similar to, for instance, how the United States Postal Service is required to provide service to people in rural communities, whereas if we privatize that system, that access could be compromised. And so if we kind of think about high-speed internet access in the same way, we might potentially find ways forward that could be more equitable. And then in terms of audio gear, yeah, this is absolutely a problem. There are just certain costs that are involved, and we certainly can't expect everybody to be able to outlay those costs, right? I'm using an external microphone. It costs $99, but for many people, that's actually cost prohibitive, right? So I think in educational contexts, I think schools should be providing good audio equipment to students. Employers could potentially do this as well. I think that could go a long way in helping so that private citizens don't necessarily have to bear the burden of that. And I will also say that there's often an element of toxic masculinity involved when we get into conversations about gear. That's maybe a subject that I don't want to broach with 2 minutes left. But yeah, I would also like to see the culture change around discussions about gear. So it's less gendered, and those discussions about kind of good solutions for people are a little bit less discriminatory, because that also becomes problematic.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this fascinating presentation and definitely thoughtful answer and your perspective. Thank you for your perspective. I want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And with that, thank you again for joining today, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.